All right, what's going on, guys? I've been having a lot of fun making these Delta breakdown videos, or just breakdown videos in general. So I thought I'd make another one out here in the California Delta. This is my second take because I got a little too lost in the sauce. So I'm gonna try one more time, and hopefully it's a little bit better. So the reason I want to break down this place is it's over 1,500 miles of a navigable waterway, and it's pretty overwhelming. There's just so much water out here, so many places to launch. I just kind of wanted to break down just some concepts that were explained to me from some people I respect, and I think that people in general will benefit from kind of having some of the same ideas floating around in their head. Like my other videos, obviously north up's always going to be this way, east this direction, west this way, and south down here. Okay. One of the first things I want to talk about is just, maybe one of the most important concepts on the Delta as a whole, and that's tidal influence. The reason tidal influence is important, whether it be from the ocean, the moon, just the water in general, is that controls everything out here. The fish, the food, everything's controlled by tidal influence. Okay, so if we zoom out really quick, especially in Northern California, I mean, that's the only place the Delta is, but a lot of the major reservoirs and rivers, whether that's the Calaveras, the McCollum, the American River, Sacramento River, Feather River, if we zoom out as far as Lake Shasta, Folsom Lake, some of the large reservoirs over here, Comanche, Hogan, they all eventually end up draining into the Delta, and that's part of the reason what makes this place so fertile and so special, why there's so much farmland around here, is just the amount of water that comes in, right? Everybody wants the water. It's been a battle for many years. People are trying to take the water, push it down to LA. People are trying to take the water, feed all the farms. It's just a battle between, the fishermen, the fish, the world, the environment, the state of California. Everybody's a part of it. So if we look this way, right, the Delta eventually pushes out into San Francisco Bay and then out into the Pacific Ocean. And it's just important to remember, right, that although this is mostly fresh water, it is just interesting to think about how far that water travels before eventually getting into the ocean. I think the Delta is one of the most special places in the entire United States, maybe even in the world. There's just not a lot of places like this. It's a very unique place, very special place, and that's why for a very long period of time it was one of the best bass fisheries in the entire world. And it probably still is, but unfortunately, I'm about 24 years old. I kind of missed prime Delta time frame, that kind of like 1990 to 2011, 12 time period where this place really was one of a kind. People were sticking 30, 40, 50-pound bags. I mean, people thought the world record, was maybe going to come out of here. It was just such a special place, but it's just a lot different than it used to be. And one of the ways that it's different is there used to be no grass or very little grass in this place. And if you were to come out here today, you're going to say there's grass everywhere. And, that was kind of before my time, so I can't speak too much on what exactly this place looked like, but that is one of the reasons that it's a lot more clear and maybe it's a little tougher. And, there's just a lot of things going on out here that weren't always, but don't let that take away the fact that there's still plenty of, giant fish that live in this place. And, every year when a tournament comes around, it's still taking 20, 25, 30 pounds, to win potentially. So, there's not a lot of places where you can say that that's the case, and that's part of what makes this place so special. One of the concepts that, somebody that's spent a lot more time out here than me, told me as a young lad, which helped me, and I thought I'd share with you guys, is kind of breaking this place down by section and sticking to one of those particular areas and trying to learn it. So we'll kind of jump around here for a second, and then we'll kind of come back to that concept. So we'll kind of talk about a couple launch ramps, a couple key areas of the Delta, right? First one's going to be BMW. This is kind of a central-ish north launch area, okay? going above this ramp is all going to be giving you access to the North Delta. And there's kind of two North Deltas. I don't want to get too confusing, but if you take the Sac River up, come up here into the Liberty area, this is also considered the North Delta, but it's not as easy to get back and forth between these two areas just with how all the channels works. You kind of have to make a decision whether you're going to come up to Liberty or come up to kind of the McCollum River area. Next key ramp is going to be in the Central Delta, and that's going to be Russo's Marina. This place gets, a ton of tournaments out of it all the time. It's probably one of the most popular ramps in the entire Delta. So that's a key one. Central Delta area. Come out here to the west. You got Big Break, same thing. Fields a ton of tournaments. This is, West Delta area. And come over here. We'll go to Stockton, and we can check out Ladd's Marina. No, I kind of lost it on the map here a second ago. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble finding it. Here it is. Okay, so yeah, Ladd's Marina, super East Delta launch point. A lot of tournaments, especially the Wednesday nighters. You guys want to come out fish some tournaments during the summertime? That's a fun one. And then lastly, coming down here south to Tracy Oasis. This is a super southern launch. Also Discovery Bay. A lot of people have heard of that place because a lot of people live out there. It's another South Delta area. So we kind of have those concepts in mind. So we'll come back to what I was just talking about, philosophically, and that would be kind of a plan of attack when coming out to the Delta. Something that was explained to me was, hey, why don't you choose an area nearby to you? So for me, right, that was Sacramento. Live in Sacramento. One of the closest ramps to me was Wimpy's Marina, New Hope. And this is the North Delta, okay? So what I told myself was, hey, I'm going to fish only the North Delta. So pretty much, Wimpy's and above, and then all the way down here to Highway 12, kind of that BMW area. I'm just going to focus on the South McCollum, North McCollum, Georgiana Slough, Snodgrass Slough, everything I have access to in this area, okay? And I did that for about a year, and it taught me a lot of things. The reason that I like this idea, especially for people that are new, is you're not getting overwhelmed running, hundreds of miles out on the Delta, driving all these different ramps. You're going to pick an area, and you're going to learn it. And one of the most important things you're going to learn about your area is you're going to learn what everything looks like on high tide, what everything looks like on low tide. And I really mean that on low tide, because low tide is really when you do the most learning, because you're going to see what's on the bank. You're going to see potential hazards you don't want to hit. Maybe you see the fish that you didn't see during high tide. And you're really going to learn, right? So for example, let's say, what I like to do is if you have an area that you want to target, right? So let's just come on down here. We'll just say this island, for example, okay? I wouldn't just hit this island on high tide, not catch any fish, and just say, hey, I'm never coming back. I don't think that's the right idea. You want to kind of hit everywhere in your area on low, high, incoming, outgoing, mid-tide, until you figure out, A, this is when the fish here bite, or B, there just isn't fish here, right? And some of that can be eliminated, whether, hey, the grass looks bad, hey, there's no bluegill, there's no shad, there's no bait fish, hey, maybe there's seals just eating everybody around here, I shouldn't be here. Those are some of the things you can look at before you target an area. But let's say you say, hey, there should be fish here, right? This is a nice little oxbow. There's a bunch of current that comes around here. There's an island. There's grass. There's going to be a fish in the area. You just have to figure out when the optimal time to target them is, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about tidal influence and how you can use that in your particular area to kind of understand the fish, okay? So when we have a tide, right, where you essentially have 4 tides in a 24-hour period, give or take, okay? 2 lows, 2 highs. Every 2 weeks, the tides reset. And what I mean by that is, like, if you fish a certain tide on a Sunday and you come back 2 weeks later, the tide should be very, very similar to what you did on that Sunday. And that's kind of a tournament trick you can kind of use if you're really trying to match the tides, right? So the water's going to push in from the west on an incoming tide, right? So a concept that you could use is, hey, if I fish this point on the low switch, so low tide, it switches and now it's starting to come back in. You get on a little bite, you catch them really good on this point, okay? You could run back over to Frank's track and the water still isn't moving yet because you're running inland, right? So now, hey, I'm going to jump on another Thule point over here on this island. I'm going to catch my fish. Cool. Okay, now I'm going to continue to run inland, whether that be east, deep south, or up north. Hey, I'm going to run up north to that island we just talked about. Hey, I'm going to fish around this island on that same low switch, and I'm going to catch them, right? So that's one of the things that these people are doing out here that are super successful, is they're running spot to spot to spot and hitting it on those key tide switches or tide levels, right? So that's something to think about in your area, and we'll kind of talk about that for a second, okay? So we'll come back to our little island here, right? If you're not familiar with the tides, this is kind of a way that I like to explain it, is you have a bathtub, okay? On low tide, your bathtub is almost empty, and as the tide starts to come in, which would be a low incoming tide, that bathtub slowly starts to fill up, okay? Once that bathtub gets full, you have your high tide, and then you have your outgo. Your high outgoing tide is that flush. And what that flush means is all that water that just pushed into the system is all going to be cooking out west to go back out into the ocean, right? So with those concepts in mind, that's kind of how you're going to think about the bank when you're fishing, okay? If I'm a bass and there's some Thules here, right? This is a flat. If it's low outgoing tide and I'm a bass, I'm going to be uncomfortable being up in these Thules because I'm losing depth and I'm essentially going to suck out into this channel or to the edge of the grass line or maybe come up onto this island in the meantime because I don't like that feeling of the water leaving. Now, on the contrary, if I'm a big bass and I'm living on this grass line and all of a sudden I have that low switch and that water starts filling back up, right? Now I'm going to start pushing back up into these Thules and being happy essentially for the next, 8-hour period or however long we have in between our tide switches, right? So that's something you want to be thinking about is, hey, just because you go up to a bank and let's say there's no water on it, but there's all these logs, you could very easily come back there on high tide and that's all submerged and there's fish sitting on it, okay? I mean, you can have up to a 4-foot difference in a tide, right? If you look on Navionics would be an example where you can look at different tide tables for different areas of the delta, right? You might say, hey, today I have a 4.1 foot high tide. That's a big high tide. That's a lot of water, okay? Now I have a point, a negative point, 2.5, which would be a quarter of a foot low tide. What that means is that water is going to be draining out to that point, okay? And that might not make a lot of sense in the beginning, but let's say you have a 1.1 foot low tide and a 3.5 high tide. Those numbers are close, and what that means is there's not going to be that much water movement, and people have referred to that as like a tidal coefficient, okay? Now, on the contrary, let's say you have a negative 1 foot tide and a high of a 4 foot tide. That's a big flush of water. That's almost 5 feet. And the reason that's important is that's going to change on a daily basis, right? How much water is coming in and out of the system. So if we think historically, right, on the days where there's a really big tide, there's going to be a lot of water moving. Maybe that's a good thing in the summertime because it's going to keep the fish more active. Now, let's say it's the spawn. Maybe having a little bit less of a tide push could be a better thing because those fish are trying to hunker down and focus on, making their beds and doing their different things. But if you're not paying attention to the tide on the delta, you're wrong. That's pretty much the only way to put it, because if you're just running around aimlessly, you're either going to hit stuff physically with your boat, you're going to not catch any fish, or you're just going to be kind of backwards and not know why you suck, essentially, right? And that's because you're not understanding the tides. So we'll kind of break down another little concept, right? So let's say we're fishing in the Mokelumne River, okay? And it's a high incoming tide. So that would mean the water is pushing this way inland and filling up. If you're just letting your boat get pushed with the tide like you're in a river or something, I would say that's not ideal. And the reason that's not ideal is because the fish face into the current, okay? They are looking into the current. So you want to fish into the current as well, because then your bait is going to come downstream, even though this isn't a stream, right? But it's going to come downstream into the fish's face. So you could quite literally be throwing your baits almost backwards at like the backs of the fish if you fish with the current. You want to fish against the current the best you can, okay? Sometimes it's not very easy because of how hard it's pushing, but that's something to think about. Coming back to the, choosing your area philosophy, right? If you pick this area that you want to fish and you learn, hey, this island's really good on high tide. Hey, this bank's really good on low tide. You're going to start to learn where you need to be and when you need to be there. And that's very important when you fish the Delta, because there are fish all over the place, okay? Just because you heard, oh, so-and-so caught a 10-pounder in Frank's track, there's no big fish up where I am, that's not true. There are double digits all over this place. Now, granted, there might be more in certain areas, but I really believe that just about everywhere out here, you have a chance of catching a double digit or your personal best, right? So try not to think about what everyone else is doing. Think about what you're doing and think about, all the stuff you have control over, right? And this place is 1,500 miles, right? It's not like you're going to some little lake and you can fish the whole thing in a day. You absolutely cannot do that. I've barely even fished this whole place in 4 years at all. I wouldn't even say I've fished, over 50% of all the water out here. Maybe even less than that. I mean, it takes a lifetime to learn this place. So that's why I like this kind of concept of, hey, choose your area, learn your area, learn how the fish move in the Delta, learn how they set up, and then you can start applying those concepts elsewhere, right? Let's say you find a little island like this one we talked about. Hey, it has an oxbow. Hey, there's deep toolies on the outside edge, and then the middle there's an island with a big flat. This area kind of seems like there's big fish on it. Where's somewhere else that I could fish that's kind of like this? So you ask yourself that, right? Well, you start coming to a different area of the Delta, and you're like, hey, this island kind of sets up the same as that other one. I'm going to run down here on a similar tide and see if I can catch them. And those are those concepts and those foundations that you're going to build as an angler the more that you come out here, right? And that's what's crucial. If you understand how to catch fish in your area of the Delta, you can catch fish anywhere in the Delta. Now it's just going to be about finding those spots. And those spots are what take time. If you run to a new area every single trip, you're going to learn kind of nothing unless you're killing them every trip, which you're probably not because you're unfamiliar with the area, right? Versus, hey, I've fished the same area for a year, and now I've developed a milk run. I have 10 spots in the North Delta that I've caught a 6-pound bass on, right? And that's not a coincidence. The chances are there's probably other big fish there. And now you have to learn how to hit those spots and when to hit those spots in order to catch those fish. And once you feel confident with that, you could say, hey, I'm going to start branching out and I'm going to explore. And now I'm going to have a better idea of what to look for. And that's really the key. Is everyone says, hey, the whole Delta looks good. How do you know where to fish? Well, you want to fish where the big ones are. Well, what does that mean? Maybe that's a different video where we can kind of talk about some of those observations that I've made up to this point. But you are going to be able to make those observations and those determinations yourself when you've put in that time and you've learned those things, right? Like you could say, for example, hey, I've noticed that every time on low tide, if I can find a bank with a bunch of wood that sticks out into the channel, there's going to be a big one sitting right on the end of that wood. And they're going to sit there until the tide starts to fill back up. Well, if you know that, now I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to go look for other areas that set up the same way, kind of like what we talked about with the island. That's all information for yourself. And you're going to build historical data, right? So, for example, you'd be like, hey, every spring I notice that there's a bunch of fish that move into Sycamore Slough to spawn. Well, that's not a coincidence. That's probably something that's been happening for however many years there's been bass in the Delta. And that's information you're going to use, right? Versus like, oh, hey, every summer there's a ton of fish in the McCollum in this main channel. Well, that's information that you're going to store. And the more that you build that, the more you're going to have for those seasonal patterns. Like, hey, every fall I need to be here doing this. Hey, every spring I need to be over here doing that. And those are all concepts that are going to build you as an angler, okay? So those are just kind of some basic foundational concepts that I think are important to realize, for the Delta. Whether you live up in Sacramento, you live down in Stockton, you live somewhere down south, you live in the Bay somewhere. I would pick an area if you're new and start trying to break it down, understand the tides, pay attention to what's happening. If you catch, a 7-pounder out of nowhere, hey, maybe take your phone out and say, hey, what's the tide doing? What's the level of the tide? What's the weather? What's the time of year? Keep that in mind for next time. And if you're out fishing, you say, hey, that spot's kind of setting up the same way it did when I caught that big one last week. Hey, maybe you should be on that spot at that same time. Maybe something special is going to happen. So those are just some general concepts, like I mentioned before. A little side note I want to touch on. I just hit 100 subscribers. I'm really thankful for that. Appreciate everybody subscribing. If you guys like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any questions on the Delta and I am able to help you, leave those in the comment section and I'll get back to you guys. I'm going to be putting out some actual fishing content here soon enough, once it gets a little bit nicer out. So I'm excited for that. But like I said, have a lot of fun with these videos and I look forward to making some more. I will talk to you guys soon.